having very good practices around screen lock, two-factor authentication, using biometric passwords wherever possible, just making sure that particularly for close access scenarios, you leave your device on the table and walk away to go to the bathroom, that no one can kind of log into your device and pair a device surreptitiously.
Welcome to another episode of Mandiant's Defender's Advantage podcast. I am your host, Luke McNamara. Today, joining me to talk about what will be a new blog when this episode comes out is Dan Black, principal analyst here, working on a range of different stuff, but especially some of our cutting-edge Russia research. Dan, great to have you here.
Yeah, super excited to chat with you, Luke.
So we're going to talk about this blog tied to targeting by Russian threat actors of Signal Messenger and encrypted communications. Before we get into the meat of it and what we observed and what we've been tracking and analyzing with this, I think it would be useful for folks who maybe aren't aware the last several years of the Russian conflict in Ukraine, specifically looking at the cyber operations piece. We've seen kind of these different phases of the conflict where there's been a different focus, different emphasis in some of what Russia has sought to use its cyber capabilities to accomplish, to support. I thought it'd be useful before we kind of get into the meat of this to kind of go through how that has evolved to where we are today and the context by which we are looking at this new set of activity.
Absolutely. I think it's really important to kind of unwind a little bit what's happened over the past 3 years of war, just particularly because I think there's this popular perception that it's been much of the same, and the things that were happening in February 2022 have kind of continued to present. And so not to get too into the weeds here, into the different phases of the conflict, but it is very important to contextualize the different parts of the war to be able to understand Russia's cyber campaign in Ukraine. And so I think the pieces that people are probably most familiar with are those opening months of the war, through things like the battle for Kiev, the battle for Donbass, battle for Kharkiv, and some of those other consequential battles in the opening months of the war, where we saw this concerted campaign of wiper attacks focused on things that are often referred to as counter-value targets. So for people who aren't familiar with the term, counter-value means things like government networks, media entities, civilian infrastructure, things like the power grid, for instance. And this is a category of targets that the Russian military write-in refers to often as Ukraine's anthropogenic shell. So it's these life support systems that, if disrupted, would create these disorganizing effects or psychological effects that could help grind the government and society to the halt in Ukraine. Right. And so over the first year of the war, really, what we saw was this really high volume campaign of sabotage, of wiper attacks, disruption efforts to kind of go after these counter value targets. But what we saw, right around the first year, the first anniversary of the conflict, is that after a year of attempting to amass psychological pressure versus these cyber disruptions, Russia seems to have recognized that indirect pressure wasn't really providing the military advantages that it had hoped for. And so right around that 1 year anniversary, this is the period in the lead up to Ukraine's 2023 counteroffensive for those folks who've kind of followed the details of the war a little bit closer. This is where we start to see these sweeping changes in the nature of the cyber campaign inside of Ukraine from Russian threat actors. Of the several changes underway, the most notable was that we start to see this shift away from those government and civilian targets, those counter-value targets that dominated the early focus of the war, towards military devices and systems. I think the types of targets that we all kind of expected to factor heavily into a wartime campaign of cyber operations, right? So in practical terms, the shift not only results in an increasing prioritization of espionage over sabotage, so we start to see them prioritizing that decision advantage and longer-term access to target networks, but it also rapidly starts to position mobile devices like smartphones and tablets used at the front lines by Ukrainian soldiers as a critical center of gravity for Russia's cyber units. And so over the past 2 years, this mobile focus has become the cornerstone of Russia's wartime cyber operations and is largely what we'll be talking about today in a little bit more detail.
Before we get into that, when you see this sort of evolution in the nature of the targets and then also the nature of the activity itself, right? You differentiate between like the cyber sabotage versus the espionage focus. Some of this is maybe impossible to know given that it's getting that intent, but how much of that do you think is sort of experimentation with using cyber in a wartime setting and what works, and how much of it could also be sort of operational needs at those different stages of the larger conflict going on?
Yeah, no, great question. I think it's a little bit of both at the same time, right? There's clearly a pattern of adaptation that's going on throughout the conflict. Russia's learning from its own mistakes across the course of the war, and it's also just adapting to facts on the ground, right? And I think what's really important to think about is that, that opening part of the war, those opening months, if you remember, it was like a multi-pronged invasion plan. They're coming from the north, they're coming from the south. It's a highly dynamic environment. And it's an environment where I think it's very hard for cyber operations to keep pace with the changing circumstances on the ground, right? And so instead of trying to sequentially support cyber or the military operations, the ground forces and what they're doing, what you start to see is them try to amass psychological pressure in parallel to those boots on the ground activities, right? And so it's very much an indirect approach to supporting things. But as we start to see the war turn more attritional, when it starts to become a war of inches and it's not moving so quickly, this is where we really start to see this effort to plug cyber capabilities more into the sequential nature of supporting directly different forms of military action, whether they be kinetic or other things like that.
So that brings us today. That brings us to this blog that will have just been released when this episode comes out. The activity, as you noted, goes back, though, further. What are we seeing around the targeting of mobile generally, but specifically around encrypted messengers like Signal in particular?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that is perhaps an open secret about this conflict at this point in time is that Ukraine has relied heavily on Signal Messenger as a means to command and control its war effort, right? And so on the front lines, a lot of soldiers are using this to be able to stay in contact with other soldiers, to receive operational commands and things like that. And this really put pressure on Russia to try to find ways to gain access, to be able to eavesdrop on those sensitive communications, to find different forms of decision advantage on the front lines. And so while we're going to be talking heavily about Signal today, I think it's important to caveat that these tactics, this targeting is not unique to Signal. We've seen targeting of a similar nature against other encrypted messaging applications like WhatsApp and Telegram. And they're really an effort to try to be able to gain this persistent long-term access to these chats, to be able to use that information in different ways, whether it be for counterintelligence purposes, to be able to predict where Ukrainian troop movements might happen, or if they're able to gain things like geolocation information from those devices to enable follow-on kinetic activity as well.
So let's get into it. What have we been observing? Several different Russian threat clusters carry out when they're going about targeting Signal.
Yeah, so I think the activity that we've detailed in the blog can kind of be broken down into three main categories. The first is kind of your traditional mobile malware delivery with some malware that's been tailored specifically to be able to harvest messages from Signal. So there's been some really great reporting on this from both the Security Service of Ukraine and the UK's National Cybersecurity Center for a malware called Infamous Chisel. You can see in some of the writing that they've done, there's a bunch of capabilities built into that malware that essentially recursively search through directories where those Signal messages would be stored on a mobile device. But they also go through other things. They're looking for Discord messages, for KML files, which would be like the files used for geolocation purposes and mapping, so real-time situational awareness on the battlefield. So they're really looking for all kinds of various forms of tactical intelligence that could be used on the front lines from some of that malware. But Signal seems to be one of the main thrusts of activity that they're trying to achieve from some of that as well. So the second thrust of activity that we've seen from Russian threat actors is to use capabilities in a post-compromise context to steal database files where Signal messages might be stored. And so we've seen different implementations of this used, largely using living off the land techniques, to try to source where those Signal database files are being stored, either in a Windows desktop environment or other environments, and then staging those for exfiltration, which can then be sent back to an actor-controlled server for post-processing. And then the third pillar of activity that we've seen, perhaps the most novel and interesting, has been the systematic abuse of Signal's legitimate linked device feature. So for those of you who don't necessarily use Signal on a day-to-day basis or other encrypted messaging applications, these apps typically have a feature that enables the app to be used on multiple devices concurrently. So you can scan a QR code and link your Signal messenger from your mobile device onto a desktop environment, which is kind of where that second thrust of activity was focused in terms of its targeting. And this is kind of where we start to see a lot of threat actors innovating different tradecraft to try to get a victim to surreptitiously link their device to an actor-controlled Signal instance.
So I think that's one of the interesting things, as you noted in here, is that this expands and goes beyond just mobile in the way that they're approaching this, given the usage of the Signal client that exists on desktop, and the ability to kind of link Signal accounts. How are we observing from what we can tell or what we suspect? How are they leveraging that linking function in particular with some of the devices that they've been going after?
Yeah, so the ways that we've seen this implemented is largely in traditional spear phishing operations. So the messages are typically sent over Signal Messenger or the application that's being targeted, kind of to develop some of that trust in that it looks like a legitimate message. And the messages often originate from a trusted contact or, for example, a service account for a tool that might be familiar to the Ukrainian military. So in one of the examples we have in the blog, they're targeting UNC 4221, one of the clusters that we're tracking, was targeting a platform called Teneta, which is like the networking component for an artillery application that the Ukrainian military uses. And the signal messages that were sent were coming from what appeared to be a Cropiva service account. So it looked like a trusted communication to say, hey, join this group. This is your new group that you're going to be operating in through the course of the day.
Well, I was gonna say, I think you could imagine in a context where, let's say, there's a captured device that they gain access to, they're a trusted contact that's maybe in a Signal chat that's existing, the ability to kind of leverage that and rapidly exploit that access on the battlefield to kind of get inside those communication loops. That seems to be an area where, again, kind of throughout all this context, there seems to be a very, very tactical use case here that this activity is likely being leveraged for.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. So I think one thing that's really important to think about here is that when with Signal specifically, when you pair a different device to your Signal account, those messages are being sent asynchronously to both the original device and the second device in real time, right? And so if you are a threat actor like APT44 who's exploiting this kind of method, you're basically giving yourself a persistent access to the target's messages coming in the future. And that is even true even if that device gets turned off or it doesn't have connectivity at that point in time or any of those different dynamics. And with APT44 specifically, we've also seen, to your point, them exploiting things in a close access context. So, for instance, being able to collect captured devices on the front lines, perhaps from an abandoned position or things like that, and being able to try to link those messages back and be able to not just get access to the messages, but it also perhaps be able to see some of the contacts of that individual and use those for follow-on targeting as well. So there is a cyclical nature. Getting access to one device enables follow-on targeting of other folks who may be in that person's group chats, contact list, etc.
Can you talk a little bit about the QR codes and kind of how they tie into this activity?
Yeah, so for those, like I said before, who haven't really linked a device with Signal or WhatsApp or any of those platforms before, linking a device typically requires you to scan a QR code. And what that does is when you scan the QR code, it instantly links the two chats together and you'll start to see everything replicating onto the other device. And so what we've seen threat actors doing is crafting these malicious QR codes that when scanned will link the victim's account to an actor controlled Signal instance hosted back wherever that the threat actors may be registering their infrastructure.
And I think one of the things, we were talking about this beforehand, but I think one of the interesting things about this problem is the fact that this activity by its very nature is kind of sitting outside of a traditional, what you would be monitoring in a security operations center, right? Traditional kind of network architecture. And so as a result, it becomes harder to know and have observations that some of this activity is going on. And then again, the sort of rapid exploitation of these devices and this access when they're able to get it seems like it enables the threat actor to kind of accelerate some of this activity very, very quickly without any sort of visibility on the part of security defenders to kind of monitor for or detect it.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think one of the most sticky problems here and why this is such a low signature form of compromise when it's successful is that it really requires end user discipline to report the activity that they've seen, right? There's no real centralized monitoring solutions for a security team to be able to monitor the end-to-end encrypted messages that are coming in on an individual's personal device over Signal, right? And so if a spear phishing message comes in, your SOC's not going to pick that up and be able to search all across other devices. It's very much reliant on that person who was targeted in the first place to report that to the centralized team. And that centralized team then has to communicate to others that might be there to say, hey, did you get similar messages, to try to see if it was a one-off, if there's a more scaled campaign at play and stuff like that. And what you see there is over time is that there's just for each person to carry out the responsibilities to report what's going on here, it really creates a lag time for security teams to be able to effectively respond. to the nature of the campaign itself. And I think even more importantly is that when this is in the context of something like a frontline unit who may have a drone flying overhead, I think the last thing they might be thinking about in the world is trying to triage whether or not there's a compromised device that might be linked to their Signal account. I think they have more acute concerns that might be kind of occupying their minds at those points in time. So it's kind of a little bit of a tricky problem to try to be able to get people to respond to this kind of stuff. And for security teams who are kind of trying to support this stuff, you have no direct means to do so. You really are reliant on interacting with the targets of the activity themselves.
Yeah, in some ways, it's not too dissimilar of what we've seen with some of like in the cybercrime space stuff from Scattered Spider or the threat actors that use SMS-based phishing. Again, if it's not on a corporate device where there's anything to detect that coming in, if it's a personal device and then that's being leveraged in for access into the larger enterprise, in those contexts, it is kind of outside, the visibility of the security folks. And I think kind of fits within this trend that we called out in M Trends last year around evasion of detection. And I think even in that report they mentioned, it's still a small percentage that we see QR-based phishing, but it has been ticking up. And so I think this is certainly, obviously in the context that it's happening, certainly a useful way for threat actors to kind of leverage things. One thing I want to get into is, when we talk about mobile targeting, I think a lot of people's first thoughts, certainly my own, go to activity like that gets publicly reported around NSO Group or some of these commercial surveillance vendors and the capabilities they're deploying. Maybe talk about how this kind of differs from what we understand it and those capabilities, how it differs between the two.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the things you often see when we start to see these commercial spyware vendors activity unearthed in the public realm is that these are really top of the shelf, exquisite exploits that are being used, right? They're often zero-click exploits, chain 0 days together, things that are not really in the reach of your average operator. They're costly, they're hard to maintain, and they're selectively sold to specific folks out there, right? Like not every government can get their hands on every capability. There's a geopolitical lens to a lot of how those dynamics unfold. What is a little more insidious about some of this activity that we've seen from Russian linked threat groups, particularly with the device linking, is that it's just run-of-the-mill phishing and malware delivery operations. The tradecraft behind it is very commodity. You're just altering some HTML files for some of the spear phishing campaign stuff that's being sent. And so this is a much more accessible means of compromise for mobile devices. And I think the concern that I personally have, at least, is that it's much more prone to replication by less capable actors. I think there's a real risk here that this stuff is really going to spread across different regions and dynamics, and particularly also into the cybercrime world, where the folks can really get a bang for their buck in these cheap phishing kits. So one of the groups, I give you an example, is operating a WhatsApp phishing kit that you get a lifetime license for $600. So this tradecraft really is super accessible and really doesn't take much to get configured. It's kind of click and deploy for them to be able to get up and running.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about sort of the implications of this. As we noted in the report, this is activity that we are seeing particular to a particular region in conflict at the moment, but I think it would be a mistake to think it's obviously going to be isolated there, either by the threat actors that are currently doing it, or other threat actors that adopt it for their own kind of aims. We're also recording this episode, several months after some of the guidance that we've seen come out around responding to the Salt Typhoon attacks and using encrypted messengers, end-to-end encrypted messengers, as one way to kind of mitigate that threat. So kind of putting this activity in context of that, what are some of the takeaways for you when you kind of, think about more individuals moving to end-to-end encrypted messaging as a way to kind of thwart that one particular problem, but now also having to be cognizant of some of the other things that are now going on in the mobile targeting space?
No, that's right. I think the saying is necessity is the mother of innovation or invention, right? And the idea here is that I think the war forced Russia to innovate on this front just because of the popularity of Signal being used. But I'm sure the services have realized there in Moscow and in other places that tradecraft is much more valuable for a range of different collection requirements, foreign political, you name it, right? And so I do think there is a tremendous risk that we're going to see proliferation happen in this space. I think we've already seen it in some instances. So there was a great blog by Microsoft in January looking at an adversary that we track as Cold River, or UNC4057, known by them as Star Blizzard, who was using the device linking tradecraft as well to try to go after the WhatsApp accounts. of targets, right? And so we're starting to see this get a wider berth already, particularly in the Russian ecosystem. But I think there is, to your point, much a tremendous risk that we're going to see this playing out in different conflict dynamics. So the Israel-Hamas conflict is a prime place to start to see that, but also in some of the places that aren't necessarily above the threshold yet, but are still having a lot of geopolitical tensions build up, such as in the case of the Salt Typhoon incident that you referenced before. In particular, I think that case is particularly interesting because there was written guidance released in December from the U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency recommending that individuals in senior government positions start to use only end-to-end encrypted communications, so not to have calls that can be intercepted by those kind of capabilities in the future. And I think, in many respects, there's this risk, right? That people start to think that, hey, I moved to Signal and I'm secure now, that's the panacea and the solution to the problem. And what we're seeing from Russia is that, no, there are capabilities, there's tradecraft that can be adopted to get after those messages, those phone calls, etc., if people start to pick up on it more. And so as we start to see that increasing adoption over time, the likelihood that we're going to see more efforts to target it from Russia and other adversaries in China, Iran, North Korea, you name it, is going to increase precipitously.
So wrapping this all up, when you think about mitigations, detection measures, and thinking about this especially for not just folks in senior government positions that may be using, end-to-end encrypted messengers, but also folks in other sort of at-risk user groups, right? Journalists, human rights activists that we often see, their mobile devices being kind of front and center in some of this targeting. What's some advice that you would kind of give around this of things they should be thinking about or cognizant of when using these or trying to detect this type of activity?
I think the first and foremost, unfortunately, for the Signal and WhatsApp world at this point in time, is a lot of end user discipline. So making sure that you're auditing your linked devices regularly for unauthorized devices is going to be a huge part of that tradecraft. Just because there's no centralized means of monitoring those things today, it's very important for end users to be able to go and check those things once a week, once a day, just to make sure things are not being linked to the device that are malicious. Large credit due to Signal here, who's worked with us through the course of our research here as well, who's implemented some new features inside the iOS and Android versions of Signal to try to make some of these linked device tradecraft a little bit more difficult to operate and less likely to succeed in the future. So I think there's going to be a little bit of a cat and mouse game always, like everything else, when it comes to social engineering aspects for them to try to adapt to some of the defensive measures being put in place. And so being cognizant of what some of this looks like in practice, I think is very important. Further on that point, I think exercise caution when engaging with QR codes is a huge part of the puzzle here too. So, what we've seen from the social engineering aspects of these campaigns, they're often masked as things that are going to urge the victim into immediate action. So something like a security update, a security alert, a group invite from a known contact saying, hey, join this group, those kind of things, right? And so just be judicious about clicking those kind of things, right? If someone's sending you a group invite with a QR code and they're a known contact, have them invite you directly to the group rather than you having to scan a QR code, right? There's just certain aspects of this stuff that aren't really necessary in terms of the grander scheme of things. And I think having just a little bit more caution when interacting with links, generally that are being sent to you over Signal and WhatsApp from known contacts as well as untrusted contacts is very important. And then I think the final aspect of it is just having very, very good practices around screen lock, two-factor authentication, using biometric passwords wherever possible, right? Just making sure that particularly for close access scenarios, you leave your device on the table and walk away to go to the bathroom, that no one can kind of log into your device and pair a device surreptitiously while you're not paying attention. I think this is a real risk for journalists, other at-risk communities who do a lot of engagement with different communities and are out there on the ground.
Any final thoughts as you kind of reflect on this? These shifts in Russia's usage of cyber operations in conflict, what you think we'll see more of next?
Yeah, so I think there's this popular sense that Russia has not done a great job in Ukraine, and in real terms, it's been a mixed bag, right? There's been successes and failures, but I think the one thing that we've seen is that they're very persistent and they're capable of adaptation. So when new defensive measures are put in place, when the defense adapts, so do they on the offense. And so I think as new measures are being put in place to protect against this, and as awareness is being built around it, the likelihood that they're going to adopt new capabilities, new techniques to try to get around some of the defenses that we're building in place are almost certainly to occur, right? being diligent, reporting these things to your security teams if you're seeing them on your mobile phone, so more structured actions can be taken against them to protect others, I think is really important as well. We're kind of all in this together. And so particularly when it comes to end-to-end encrypted communications, when only you can see the thing, only you can be responsible for reporting the malicious nature of what's coming towards you. And so, Google has different ways to do that. There's different ways to report things to us or to other teams. Your organization's central security teams as well, and we really encourage folks to engage with those different channels to make sure that everyone is aware of the things that are going on.
Fantastic. We'll end it right there. We'll include a link in the show notes to the blog. There's a lot more content in there that I encourage folks who are interested in this topic to go and read. And Dan, thank you for your time today. Thank you for sharing your insights around this, I think, really interesting and critical research.
Thanks, Luke. It's a lot of fun.